the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But let me say a few words about how I think Xi Jinping understands it, because I think he is clearly the most important policymaker, in the country. Some people would say he's the only person who matters. I think others also matter, but China is not as much a collective leadership as it used to be. So what do I think Xi Jinping means by that? I think there's a domestic component, which is to say he wants a robust Chinese Communist Party at the forefront of the political system. He's talked about having a People's Liberation Army that is capable of fighting and winning wars. And he's talked about, a Chinese economy that is modernized and competitive with the United States and Japan and Europe by 2049. So I think, that's one element of it. I think on the international stage, it really is about reclaiming a degree of centrality on the global stage. And if you look at a number of the major initiatives that Xi Jinping has put forth, over the past 12 years since he came to power, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which began just as a hard infrastructure project to connect some of China's lesser developed cities to external markets and to help export some of China's overcapacity, particularly in the construction area. But it morphed and it evolved over time, so that, there became a digital Silk Road. So, subsea cables and e-commerce and satellite system. There's a green Silk Road for environmental commodities and technologies. There's a health Silk Road. There's a polar Silk Road. But there's also a political dimension to the Belt and Road Initiative that I think is important to underscore, so that it's not simply about the e-commerce or 5G. It's not simply about taking on China's, technology in 5G. It can also be about helping countries learn how to control the internet, to monitor dissent. So we've seen that China has, and Huawei in particular, has worked with different governments in Africa to help them, conducted cyber training centers where they learn these kinds of skills. So, one of the really big innovations that Xi Jinping pushed in 2017 was this idea that China could be a model for other countries. And this was basically heretical. And when he first came out with it, there was even an uproar in China. And people said, no, that's not what he meant. He took a step back, but then he came back at it. So I think, part of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is that idea that China is a leader, that China has something to teach or share with the rest of the world. And I think that's very much what Xi Jinping is promoting and has promoted over his tenure. I think across a wide array of issues, you see that China is putting forth a different set of values, a different set of, norms that, again, reflect its own interests.
What are China's global ambitions, and what is its vision for its place in the world?
I think it's important to recognize that if you go back to 2014, Xi Jinping, who's the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of China, said that China should lead in the reform of the global governance system. It should not only contribute to write the rules of the game, but to create the playgrounds on which the games are played. And so I think just to start off, let's understand that he has a mission to change the international system in ways that align with Chinese interests, Chinese values, Chinese priorities. And, it's not surprising. China is the second largest economy. It has the largest military in the world. Now has the second largest population after India, but it's a big power. And why wouldn't it want the international system to reflect its own values and priorities? In terms of what that international system looks like, in some respects, it begins with China wanting, and Xi Jinping, I should say, wanting to just redraw the map of China to reclaim all of the territory that China considers to be its sovereign territory. So, that not only includes, Taiwan, but also the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands that are administered by Japan. We have a border conflict with India. All told, China has 14 different territorial conflicts. So, I think it begins with a sense going back through history to imperial times where China was considered kind of the middle kingdom, the center of the international system. So it starts with that China has redrawn the map of China to include all the territory that China considers to be its sovereign territory, China being whole again. I think second is pushing the United States out as the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific. and China being the dominant player in the Indo-Pacific militarily, right? China's already a really important player. It is the most important player in terms of trade. The US is still more important in terms of investment, but I think China is now recognized as the great power in the region. And I guess I should say it has military bases, which again is a fundamental shift from what came before, right? And the idea that China wants to have bases to protect, its people who are abroad. It wants to have bases to protect its economic interests. But is that really all it is? Is there a point at which China then becomes actually a much more engaged military power operating globally as opposed to just in the Indo-Pacific? But what is clear is that China doesn't want to have a formal US-led alliance system in Asia or for NATO. It calls the alliance system anachronistic, a relic of the Cold War, targeted against China. So I think that's a different notion as well. When it comes to the infrastructure of the 21st century, particularly digital infrastructure, I think China would like to see that digital infrastructure globally is put in place by Chinese companies, in the same way that global infrastructure, was basically provided through European or American, or in some cases, Japanese, assistance. That's the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century. And, China's fond of saying this is the Asian century, China century. So I think that would be another change in the way the world looks. And with that, again, with that technological infrastructure, with the subsea cables and the 5G and cloud and satellite systems, also comes, or would be desired by China's political values. Internet information flows are determined by the state. It wants states to have the capacity to shut what they call a shut up switch, right? So that any device that's connected to the internet at any point in time can be shut off from the state, by the state. That again is quite different from what the current sort of norms around internet governance are. Xi Jinping also has an idea that he wants to insulate the Chinese economy from the pressures of the global economy. That's what his whole dual circulation is about. So he says China can largely innovate, manufacture, and consume within itself. It wants to export, obviously. It also wants multinationals to be dependent on the Chinese economy for parts of their supply chain, but it does not want to have a dependence on the international economy. And I think that would be quite different from what you see today. So I think there are a range of norms and values that China would like to promote. One that we've seen more recently is a push for de-dollarization. It's not just the internationalization of the renminbi, of China's currency, but China would like to see the dollar play a much diminished role as a kind of global reserve currency. So I think across a wide array of issues, you see that China is putting forth a different set of values, a different set of norms that again reflect its own interests.
How do other countries view China's global ambitions?
There is a sense, and I would say it's true in both the United States and China, that we're competing for countries somehow. And the truth of it is, countries are independent agents, and they recognize their own interests, their own values, and there are important divisions between, let's say the United States and China on some issues. They may align with the United States on some and some China. Take a look at Vietnam, right? Vietnam, may in fact align with China on human rights issues or on, a sort of a broader sense of internet governance, but it certainly aligns with the United States in security. The United States is essential to Vietnam's security in the Indo-Pacific. So there are African countries who support China, because they see themselves in China. They're largely one party, one dictator states. And so China's way of doing business, China's interests around human rights, all those things resonate with these countries. And I think that's partly why you see China, China set up a training center in Tanzania for, the China model. How do you strengthen a one-party state? How do you do poverty alleviation? These are things that China has experience in, and that some, but not all African countries, will be interested in learning from China's experience. There are going to be countries like Japan and Australia and most of the countries of Europe that are 90% of the time going to be basically in line with the United States, because we do share similar political systems. We are allies, right? Military allies. We're basically all advanced economies. So you'll see that our interests are quite aligned. We tend to vote the same way on many important issues in the United Nations. And sometimes it'll be different from the way that China votes. But China has its own supporters. You know, when the United States and Europe and others bring resolutions against China for abuses in Xinjiang, for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, you know, we bring 30 countries, 40 countries, 45 countries along with us. China brings 40, 45, 50 countries along with it. But some of those countries, again, will not support China on other issues. So it's all by way of saying that, with some exceptions, like formal allies, that you're going to find a marriage here and a marriage there, and countries, again, are going to do what they believe, you know, the leaders believe is in their best interest.
How can China's growing international influence and power help benefit the world?
China can certainly play a constructive role in the international community, is now the second largest contributor to the United Nations in terms of its funds, and is the largest supporter of peacekeeping troops among the P5. There are definitely ways in which China can be a constructive actor. I wish that China would step up itself initially and more aggressively to be a constructive actor. So, for example, when it comes to climate change, China has agreed with the United States, for example, to limit methane. But that took a lot of pressure from the United States, and the United States rallying a lot of other countries to bring pressure to bear on China. I think there's a lot of room, whether we're talking about global public health, for example, what we saw with COVID, with the pandemic, what we seen with climate change, for China to actually take the initiative. There's still an element within China today, I would argue, that is a little bit more about wanting the rights of being the great power without taking on all of the responsibilities. And, you know, is there something, you know, in China's notion of collective security as opposed to alliances? Look, it's clear that the US-led alliance system has not been enough to prevent Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to prevent what's going on, you know, between Israel and the Palestinians, to take care of what's happening in Myanmar right now. So it's not enough. But what is China's idea of collective security? What has that actually contributed to resolve any of these crises either? I guess the question is, there are opportunities out there. I'd like to see China seize them and demonstrate what a China vision, what that looks like when it actually comes to pass, what positive things it brings. Again, you know, you look at something like the Belt and Road Initiative, which in many respects is a great initiative, right? So as it's laid out, designed also to, you know, fill a need for global infrastructure, but then how it was pursued was not so great. Lots of labor issues, environmental externalities, a lack of transparency. Some countries assume too much debt, you know, in terms of the projects and the return on investment. It does not look good. You know, China can learn, though. China can adjust. China can improve. I'm willing to give it some space, right, to see what it can do. But I do think that it's gotten a little bit ahead of itself in terms of setting itself out as a global leader without actually demonstrating how it leads.
How is the United States responding to China's global ambitions?
The United States has gone through two phases of US policy. I think the first, during the Trump administration, was really just a recognition that China was presenting some new and different and fairly significant kinds of challenges to US interests, and began to push back. But I think the administration pushed back in a way that didn't actually provide any alternatives to what China was doing. The Trump administration said, this is debt trap diplomacy, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I don't think actually that China initiated the Belt and Road in order to get countries into debt and make them then have to be dependent on China. I don't believe that at all. But that's what they said. They said, you know, don't use Huawei 5G in your networks. We want clean networks. But we don't actually have an alternative, right? There's Nokia, there's Ericsson. but are we really going to pay for all countries to rip out Huawei 5G and put those other technologies in? No, we're not going to do that. I think what's changed is that the Biden administration has actually tried, in conjunction with the Europeans, the Japanese, again, pointing out that this is a bigger issue than just a US-China issue. I think they've tried to respond to a number of challenges. So, with the Belt and Road Initiative, there is now the Global Gateway from the Europeans and the PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure Initiative from the US, looking at Chinese economic coercion within the G7. The Japanese have led an initiative, and the US as well, to figure out how to help countries that come under pressure, economic pressure from China, to try to get at political results. So pressuring countries like Lithuania because of their support for Taiwan, or whatever it might be, going after Australia because they called for an investigation into COVID. So how can this group of countries support countries that feel that kind of economic pressure from China? Certainly, we've become much more active in the United Nations. I mean, the Trump administration, again, complained about China, but it's hard to complain when you're pulling out of the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, the JCPOA. I mean, we were just, the Human Rights Commission. I mean, we're pulling out of all of these things. It's really difficult to make a case that we are the pillar of the current international system. The Biden administration obviously has a different perspective. And I think we saw, for example, in the International Telecommunications Union, which, China had held the leadership position for 2 terms, an American got the leadership position there, first time in 70 years. So I think there's a much bigger effort underway from the United States and other countries to try to ensure that, when China tries to insert Chinese language, into UN resolutions or Chinese interests into the resolutions, that there's a pushback and a call out that this is not going to happen. So I think the US and other countries they've awakened to sort of the full range of challenges that China is presenting. And in some cases have been very proactive. And in others, I think, for example, on the issue of de-dollarization, have not really done much, because, there's a kind of argument out there that China's not going to make much progress in this area because it doesn't have open capital markets. And so unless it has, both free floating currency and allows, capital to flow freely among countries, it's never going to be a dominant reserve currency. But I think that misses the point, because China erodes, around the edges, over time. And just like in the South China Sea, you're going to wake up one day, you're going to blink, and you're going to see a transformed landscape, with 7 artificial features sitting there. It's time for the US to wake up on that one. But my point only being that the United States has developed a pretty robust response to many of the challenges that China presents.
The U.S. is China's largest trading partner, and China's the United States' second largest trading partner, just behind Mexico. We're likely to see, again, less trade and investment in certain sectors, but a wholesale decoupling I don't think is possible, nor would I suggest is it desirable.
What is driving the discussion about decoupling from China in the US?
I would say, first of all, that economics is increasingly subordinated to national security. Everything these days in Washington in particular is viewed through the lens of national security. When you get into the specifics, I think the US has a lot of legitimate complaints about Chinese international trade and investment practices. The list includes cyber hacking into commercial networks to steal trade secrets, the abuse of intellectual property, the forced transfer of technology to Chinese joint venture partners as a condition of doing business in China, overly generous and trade distorting industrial subsidies, as well as forced labor in Xinjiang. And then I do think there is a concern in the United States, maybe a suspicion about China's geopolitical ambitions these days. I think, by way of example, I think the Hong Kong national security law that passed in 2020, which effectively annexed Hong Kong into mainland China. And there's also a belief that China plans to take control of Taiwan militarily in the not so distant future. So I think those are the issues that are animating the discussion about decoupling versus de-risking versus nearshoring.
In what industry is decoupling from China seen as most urgent or important?
I think those industries with national security nexus, but particularly technology. The US has concerns about dual-use products that are used for both civilian and military purposes. Again, think of semiconductors that are used in a telephone, but also weapon systems, or, semiconductors are basically ubiquitous in society today, and basically everything that we use has a semiconductor in it. And the question is low grade semiconductors that you use for, a microphone, is that different than, a high tech semiconductor, cutting edge semiconductor that's used in a weapon system? And I think it is. And so I think that it's likely that we will see some decoupling in the high tech sectors of society, but maintain a trade and investment relationship in not so high tech products and services.
Is a complete US decoupling from China possible?
I don't believe a hard decoupling with China is possible. The two nations today account for 40% of global GDP. The US is China's largest trading partner, and China's the United States' second largest trading partner, just behind Mexico. We're likely to see, again, less trade and investment in certain sectors, but a wholesale decoupling, I don't think, is possible, nor would I suggest is it desirable. I think the European Union estimates that about 94% of all trade and investment between the European Union and China is unobjectionable. That is, it doesn't raise national security concerns, nor is it the result of a one-sided dependency on China. And if you did a similar analysis in the United States, I think you would find a similar result that yes, there are certain portions of trade and investment and the economy that may raise national security concerns, but a lot of it doesn't. And I think that it's healthy to maintain those kinds of trade and investment relationships that don't implicate national security in any way. I think that the average American would be implicated if the United States substantially raised tariffs on imports from China, and China did the same in retaliation. I think the average American would see dramatically higher costs at the cash register for everyday items. Again, not necessarily high-tech items like a phone, although that would be implicated as well. But we get a lot of products from China, and we send a lot of products to China. And if you're an American farmer or rancher, you need access to the Chinese market. And if you decoupled the two economies, you're losing out on a very large potential customer base, right? China has 1.4 billion people, and you want to be able to reach those people and sell products to them. And we want to receive products from Chinese producers as well. So I think the average person, sometimes might try to tune out geopolitics, but I think that this issue in particular, it really does come down to dollars and cents, and it would make life harder for, poorer Americans in particular, sort of on the margin. I think they would be the most affected by a wholesale decoupling of the two economies.
They're by and large quite negative about the issue of U.S. bases, but also understand why they're valuable to what the United States does, and I don't think have a realistic expectation that the United States is likely to abandon those bases.
How does China view America's military bases in its area?
By and large, China views U.S. military bases in Asia with great contempt and insecurity as the kind of objective result of those positions, that forward deployment of U.S. forces, particularly along what is often called the first island chain, stretching down from the northern islands of Japan through to Taiwan, the Philippines, and around the Indonesian archipelago, that effectively enclose China in what they've described as encirclement by United States and its allies and partners. In general, Chinese strategists tend to think of the U.S. military bases, or tend to speak about U.S. military bases in contradictory ways, actually. And I'll lay out sort of two main lines of discussion that we've picked up on over the years in trying to understand how China thinks about military bases and perhaps some of its own. And the first of these sort of contradictory or maybe dialectically related views on U.S. basing is that they actually quite admire, from a military, operational, and even strategic standpoint, the great utility that the United States has gained from using bases in order to project military power, and in particular to conduct its logistics in order to operate intensely in multiple theaters all around the world. They look at places like Diego Garcia in the Central Indian Ocean, or Yokosuka in Japan, or Guam in the middle of the Pacific or Western Pacific, and really, no other way to describe it, admire or even seek to emulate in thinking about what would enable the PLA to project power that is equivalent to or capable of countering American power. Then on the other hand, as I said, there's a great deal of scorn for these bases, a kind of normative feeling that this is an element of American hegemony. This is a vestige of the Cold War in particular, and of China being the victim, effectively, of some power political move on the United States' part, in which all these other states are colluding. And it bears noting, we're here talking especially about Japan, for which China has special animus, but also about U.S. allies in the Philippines, a Chinese perception of a de facto U.S. ally on Taiwan, and in South Korea as well, in China's immediate neighborhood. They're by and large quite negative about the issue of U.S. bases, but also understand why they're valuable to what the United States does, and I don't think have a realistic expectation that the United States is likely to abandon those bases.
Where does China have military bases, and how would you say the U.S. views China's bases?
So the short answer to the question is China has one overseas base. It's in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa at the entrance to the Red Sea. And that is the only formal, declared, official PLA military facility that exists outside of the mainland of the PRC. There is, however, a range of commercial infrastructure and other facilities that have been used with increasing intensity by Chinese military forces operating abroad, because, as I said, they are an increasingly global force and have an increasingly global mission set, but they don't have more than this one sole base in Djibouti as a formal hub for those activities. We've just seen in December 2023 the first observed PLA Navy visits to a base in Cambodia at Ream that Chinese firms built, notionally for the Cambodian military, but for which there may or may not be more agreement among the Chinese and Cambodians about what's the nature of their use. And there are a handful of places at various stages, perhaps, of yielding a Cambodia-like arrangement. Places like Pakistan and Equatorial Guinea and the United Arab Emirates, et cetera, are some of the ones that are routinely listed when the U.S. Department of Defense tries to understand where the PLA's interest is in basing. So there's really no contest whatsoever in terms of the ability to project power overseas. The United States, by head and shoulders and a couple body lengths, has a major advantage in that sense. We can see that since 2017, when the base in Djibouti was open, we have now maybe an undeclared temporary or ad hoc basing facility at Cambodia that has materialized in the course of 6-7 years. There are not a lot of places that are going to want to effectively put that target on their back as part of the competition, the long-term strategic competition with the United States and its allies. And so I think it's important to really specify again, what are the questions for which, or what are the problems for which China foresees overseas bases as being a potential solution? And at least for now, there is not a realistic case to be made that what they're doing is building up a high-end power projection capability in Europe. or in the Middle East or in the Western Hemisphere, nor are they on a trajectory to do that based on the way that they're developing forces. This apples to apples comparison often leads us to some erroneous confidence in our conclusions about how the US and China stack up. The appropriate comparisons are something more like apples to oranges, but it's sufficient to say, looking at these capabilities stacked up, that these are the two most capable militaries in the world in almost any respect, and that a conflict between them would be catastrophic for everyone.
Does the US or China have a larger military?
You're not talking about the whole force against the whole force. What we're talking about in respect of China is almost exclusively contingencies in the Western Pacific and along China's littoral. And so there you're talking about more or less all of the Chinese forces versus whatever part of the US forces would be engaged there. So just with that caveat as a starting point, on paper, China's armed forces are larger than America's according to certain ways of counting it, and smaller according to others. The US defense budget, you may, and your listeners may well know, is substantially larger than China's reported defense budget. About $840 billion, I think, is the National Defense Authorization bill that's just passed Congress in the US. And I think the latest estimate on the Chinese official defense budget was $230 billion. So that's quite a substantial gap, but it's a question of what you get for that and also what's included in the overall figure. For better and for worse, NDAA details all of the specific line items for which this $840 billion is allocated. We know just sort of the top lines on the Chinese side, and we also know that they spend more overall on domestic security forces and also have quite an integrated industrial sector supporting defense procurement and programs, and that ought to factor in. So US is bigger there. China's bigger in terms of manpower, 2 million active personnel compared to the US, I think at 1.35 is the latest estimate. But again, these quantitative assessments are not necessarily indicative of what the real balance of military power is. Most of those are just standing infantry forces. The quality of those forces varies quite significantly. US combat forces, of course, have exercised that capability repeatedly and continuously over the course of the last 20 some odd years and longer, frankly, whereas the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, should have noted, has had very, very limited combat experience and has overall probably a lower quality of training and caliber of troop from a kind of an objective skills and tactical capability standpoint. Other capabilities that you might reasonably measure in trying to assess the relative military capabilities of the US and China are their fleet, the Navy, and in particular, what you'd think of as the battle force ships, the ones that are part of any combat operation for a Navy. The US here holds what I would describe as a qualitative edge now. The PLA Navy, their overall battle force is now over 370 ships, 140 major surface combatants, whereas the United States is now around 290 and aiming for 355, but not having much of a pathway towards reaching that given our capacity and shipbuilding and resources. So the PLA Navy is larger from a number of ships standpoint, but from a gross tonnage standpoint, the US remains significantly larger. From a quality or qualitative standpoint, the capability of the ships, the US maintains a significant edge. US operates 11 carriers, all of which are nuclear powered. These things draft something on the order of 100,000 tons compared to much smaller non-nuclear powered, much less capable carriers, two now deployed for China. And that's just one particular metric. Submarines is an even more significant example of a major qualitative and quantitative edge for the United States. So, the fact of the PLA Navy being larger ship for ship is misleading. I think most naval experts would assess US naval capability to be significantly better, But China has come on very, very fast and closed the gap in many significant ways. U.S. fields more aircraft, and in particular, more advanced aircraft, about 14,000 total for the U.S. versus only 2,800 in China. And the U.S. force is much more high quality composition, many more fourth gen and higher fighters compared to China's modernizing and improving, but still inferior air forces. The key thing to point out here is that the role of air forces in a distant theater in which the United States would meet China requires air basing and requires all sorts of things that allow that air power to project forward, to include carriers. And so there's an asymmetry in terms of the things that each country needs to do with this air power. Final two things to note are nuclear weapons. United States has a large quantitative and qualitative edge here in most respects, about 3,700 warheads in the United States versus an estimated 500 in China. Even though the Chinese figure has increased dramatically over time and is trending towards 1,000, that's still not an area where they're coming towards parity. One area in which China is arguably superior, and it's hard to get exact counts on these, but you can say in qualitative terms, is in missile forces. The PLA has, in fact, its own rocket force, a service of the PLA that controls their ballistic missile forces, which are both nuclear and conventional capable. And this is an area where the U.S., over the course of a lot of arms control, as well as fighting a lot of combat missions that didn't require intermediate and medium range ballistic missiles, basically disinvested from this element of our force, whereas the PLA has looked at this as an area of major asymmetric advantage, a way to deny the U.S. access to this East Asian theater. And so the PLA has quantitative and qualitative advantages in a lot of different types of missile forces, particularly those kind of theater range, intermediate and medium range and short range ballistic missiles, as well as some of the technological advancements in the field, like hypersonics, for example, where China has actually made some really significant progress and arguably fields superior capabilities to the US. So all of this is a long way of saying is the US as a military force on paper looks superior in most respects. However, as I said up front, what we're generally talking about when we think about US and China military competition are contingencies that are concentrated in East Asia. And so we're looking at a very different way of those forces engaging with one another. And to really get a sense of, how would such and such conflict play out, you really need to dial in some of those specifics with the presumption that they'll have the same set of strategic objectives and same set of strategic interests as does the United States.
Is the Chinese military currently an active threat to American-held territories?
Another challenging question. I'll give you the short answer, which is yes, but to U.S. territories in the Pacific primarily, like Guam and Hawaii. The longer answer is no, not really. It's a threat to that particular set of military facilities that are within the range of engaging in a fight in the Western Pacific. That's the best that I think we can say about the type of capabilities that we've been talking about over the course of this conversation, is that they are concentrated on this hypothetical fight in the Western Pacific. This apples to apples comparison often leads us to some erroneous confidence in our conclusions about how the US and China stack up. The appropriate comparisons are something more like apples to oranges. When we look at the US Navy and its capabilities in the Western Pacific, or the US Joint Force, what we should array it against is what is sometimes called China's anti-Navy, this suite of anti-access area denial capabilities, most prominently highlighted by the missile forces, but also submarines and a range of other ways in which China would look at this as an area where it must put US military forces, which include forces based on US territories, as well as the territories of allies, must put them at risk. And that's what we've seen coming into really full focus over these last few years. And it is primarily, if not exclusively, concentrated in that Western Pacific region. And so I think we really need to think more carefully as we make these types of assessments. I don't think you should trust anybody who offers a blithe assertion about here's how this or that conflict would play out. There are far too many uncertainties about the pathway to conflict and the nature of the interactions between great powers like the United States and China. But it's sufficient to say, looking at these capabilities stacked up, that these are the two most capable militaries in the world in almost any respect, and that a conflict between them would be catastrophic for everyone.
What people in Taiwan think is good for Taiwan is that they want to be allowed to live their lives, right? They don't want to live under the threat of a military invasion. They want to be able to continue to participate in the robust democracy that they've built over the past 4 decades. So I think it's really important for folks in the US to listen to what people in Taiwan want, listen to what policymakers in Taiwan think will actually benefit Taiwan's safety and security.
Why is Taiwan such a vital area in US-China relations?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So first of all, I think the US's economy and our security are really deeply connected to Taiwan. Taiwan is an important trade partner for most US states. The US economy is very reliant on semiconductors from Taiwan. So everything from our cell phones to the airplanes that we fly in, 90% of the most advanced semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. And so economically, we really are very dependent on that relationship. And if China were to invade Taiwan, I think that would have dramatic economic effects for Americans. It would be devastating in terms of the human cost for China and for Taiwan, and it would make Americans less safe in the world as a whole. I think it's become a really important kind of flashpoint in the US-China relationship for a couple of reasons. One is that the US does not really accept China's interpretation of the status of Taiwan. So the Chinese government sees Taiwan as territory that is a part, belongs to China and should be sort of incorporated into China as essentially a province. And that's something that they have said they would like to do it peacefully, maybe, but they won't renounce the possibility of using force to sort of force Taiwan to become a part of China. And the US's position is that the status of Taiwan is undetermined and has to be decided via peaceful means. And so those two positions, I think, are in some ways quite fundamentally irreconcilable. And as the areas for cooperation in the US-China relationship have really declined, as that relationship has become much more kind of fractious and contentious over the last 5 to 10 years, there's really not too much in the way of positive cooperation or engagement happening between the US and China. And so these areas of conflict, I think, have become much more central to the way that each country is viewing the other.
What is the U.S. perspective on Taiwan's future?
Right. So the U.S. position is, this is an issue for the people of China and Taiwan to resolve. And so if there was agreement on both sides of the strait that Taiwan should become a part of China, that's a position that the U.S. does not oppose. I think what they are opposed to is the idea of a unilateral solution to this problem of China deciding that it's waited long enough and deciding to invade Taiwan. So any non-peaceful resolution or a resolution that only takes the preferences of one side of the strait into account is something that I think the US is really forcefully opposed to. So I think the US for a long time has tried to play a kind of balancing role of deterring either side of the strait from taking actions that it thinks would lead to war. And the Chinese government has been very clear that it views a declaration of Taiwan independence as a kind of red line that if Taiwan were to declare independence, China would respond by invading. And so the US's sort of policy positions in the Taiwan Strait have been designed to do what's sometimes called dual deterrence, deterring China from invading and deterring Taiwan from declaring independence, which might then provoke a Chinese invasion. Which of those actions are more relevant, are more important to deter, has shifted over time. And I think right now, as we've seen a real rise in Chinese military aggression around Taiwan, there's more concern about the possibility of a Chinese invasion than there is about a declaration of Taiwan independence. It's been almost 20 years since a Taiwanese president or a serious presidential candidate has openly advocated for Taiwan independence. And it's not what most voters in Taiwan want. They want the status quo because they know that declaring independence would invite an invasion by China.
How is more US monetary and political support for Taiwan received by China and Taiwan respectively?
So I think, on the whole, people in Taiwan are enthusiastic about US support. They see US support as essential for ensuring their ability to just live the lives that they want to live. They didn't choose to, exist next to a neighbor that they see as sort of constantly engaging in military aggression toward them. And they think that US support is the main thing that will deter China from invading. And so on the Taiwanese side, on the whole, I think people feel quite positively toward US expressions of support for Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was on the whole received quite positively in Taiwan. At the same time, Taiwan is a robust democracy, and there is a real debate over this issue that is kind of playing out in the media and at the ballot box in some cases, or in electoral campaigns. And, there are some people who worry that relying too heavily on US support will draw Taiwan into a US-China conflict, will make Taiwan more likely to be a kind of pawn in that conflict, and will ultimately make Taiwan less safe. And this is a message that, is consistent with some of the messaging from Chinese media. And so it's being kind of amplified by Chinese media. And there's also some evidence that Chinese disinformation campaigns are trying to kind of amplify this message of doubting American support and, worrying that perhaps being too closely tied to America will ultimately be dangerous for Taiwan. So in some ways, that's the downside of having a very open society, is that sometimes there's more room for those kinds of disinformation messages to gain traction and become a real part of the political discourse. But it is definitely something that we're seeing in a conversation, and I think we'll see more and more of. I think the US's position on Taiwan, its sort of stated policies, have been pretty consistent since the normalization of US-China relations in 1979. So the US doesn't have a formal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, but it does have kind of robust informal ties. And what officials from the US government will say is that policy has not changed, and there's a lot of sort of room for flexibility in the articulation of those policies about what unofficial ties with Taiwan mean. At some points, those unofficial ties have been stronger. At some points, they've been weaker. At this current point in time, they're relatively strong. But fundamentally, the US is not moving toward a position of recognizing Taiwan as an independent country and is not violating the terms of the normalization of the US-China relationship. I think Chinese policymakers see it differently. They worry that the US is gradually undercutting the commitments that it made when it normalized relations with China in 1979. And so they see things like Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan as evidence that the US is engaging in more kind of formal state-to-state type relations with Taiwan. And for Chinese policymakers, they see that as unacceptable. And so they've responded in several cases with really strong shows of military aggression. So kind of practicing a blockade around Taiwan after Nancy Pelosi's visit, for instance, to demonstrate the strength of their opposition to a sort of gradual change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan.
How do U.S. and Taiwanese understandings of what is good for Taiwan differ?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think, what people in Taiwan think is good for Taiwan is that they want to be allowed to live their lives, right? They don't want to live under the threat of military invasion. They want to be able to continue to participate in the robust democracy that they've built over the past 4 decades. And so, that I think is what we see when people are not going out and, for instance, trying to push strongly for a formal declaration of Taiwan independence. They recognize that that would come at a cost, and they don't want to pay that cost, right? So they're willing to, sort of perhaps limit their political choices, right? Or not vote in ways that fully reflect, a desire for Taiwan to be seen as a country like any other country in the world, because the thing they want most is just to sort of be able to live in peace in the society that they've built. I think that on the US side, there are some politicians who are really eager to express their support for Taiwan through visits to Taiwan, through pieces of pro-Taiwan legislation in Congress. And, some of those I think are really helpful, and others perhaps do more damage than is intended, right? Sometimes they might provoke an aggressive reaction from China in a way that isn't necessarily good for Taiwan, and perhaps does make people in Taiwan less safe, less likely to be able to kind of live their lives. So I think it's really important for folks in the US to listen to what people in Taiwan want, listen to what policymakers in Taiwan think will actually benefit Taiwan's safety and security, rather than sort of using Taiwan as a tool for playing politics and perhaps earning points in the US electoral context, where they're using Taiwan as a way to show how anti-China they are.
From both, I would say, a foreign policy grand strategy perspective and from an economic policy perspective, the engagement policy has been beneficial for both US and China. Then if we're going to talk about the failure, like we mentioned earlier, that it's engagement about changing China. It's engagement about making China more like us, politically, economically, because if that is the criteria, then yes, engagement has not succeeded. But on the other hand, to say that engagement has created nothing and failed miserably, that also ignores and neglects realities that have taken place since 1972.
How and why was engagement policy created?
Of course, the United States engagement with China traces back to more than 50 years ago, when the late Henry Kissinger visited Beijing on a secret trip in 1971. And this inaugural engagement was very, very momentous at the time, because Beijing and Washington didn't have any official diplomatic relations. And this meant that the leaders didn't talk. And for the most part, Americans were scared of China. China was a red communist country. It was led by a dictator named Mao. It was poor, a developing country. So at the time, there wasn't much engagement. And Kissinger broke the ice by engaging to meet and talk with the then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. And he did so for strategic reasons. So there's always strategic reasons behind the idea of engagement. It's not that you just want to talk to the counterpart, but there's a strategic reason that he and Nixon saw a strategic benefit to such engagement. By engaging Mao, they figured they could divide and conquer the red world between China and the USSR, thus splitting the communist world. Now, fast track, 52 years or so to the APEC summit in San Francisco. Xi is now leading a China that is a rival power to the United States, competing with the United States almost on every single front. And so Xi's engagement at the gala is a very different one from what happened in 1970s.
I think there is one assumption about the engagement policy in this particular context, which is the assumption that through engagement with China, through familiarizing and the socializing China with the prevailing norms of, for example, Western democratic value, free market economy, capitalism, China will eventually become more like us. And I think that's also the reason why engagement strategy has become such a target of criticism, because 40 years later, China has not become more like us. In fact, if you look at Xi Jinping's statement, Xi Jinping is basically saying, we are Chinese, we're not going to be like you, and we have our distinct political culture, we're going to have our distinct political system. So I think that's one of the reasons that the engagement has come under so much criticism, with this assumption that China will change.
What were the successes of engagement policy for the US and for China? What were the failures?
So I want to pick up exactly where Yoon-sun left off, which is that indeed, critics might say, look, engagement was a big failure. Why? Because you look at China, you look at Xi, they're as authoritarian as can be. They did not become more liberal. That modernization theory was basically wrong, that it assumed that, as a country got richer and that it would become more democratic, and China is sort of the odd case out, where it has become richer, but it's very far from becoming democracy. But I think that is the wrong measuring stick, or at least, in the very least, it's not the only measuring stick for engagement. And because, as I mentioned earlier, the engagement in the Nixon-Kissinger era was very, very different in terms of the power differentials between China and the United States. And so 50 plus years on, engaging China really means managing a relationship with a major rival economically, militarily, culturally. And this is a very far cry from engagement with a communist country that was impoverished and closed off and behind the US in every dimension. So I basically don't think of engagement as a unitary policy through which we can assess its failure or successes by a single measuring stick of whether or not China became more Western. But rather, if that is the goal, or if that's the only measuring stick, then I think indeed the critics are right that engagement has failed, and it probably will fail in achieving that goal. But as I said, that shouldn't be the only measuring stick, and especially shouldn't be the measuring stick for today. I think engagement, meaning, meaningful, continuous dialogue, so far has had some successes. For one, dialogue has so far avoided getting the US and China into a major war. Now, we saw in APEC the resumption of military to military dialogue was one of the major outcomes of the summit. Has dialogue led to agreements to cooperate on climate change? Yes, it has. Beijing and DC have recently agreed to dial down the use of fossil fuels, among other agreements. Has dialogue led to increased cultural and educational exchanges in the past couple of decades that have in turn led to mutual understanding? I would say yes. I mean, this kind of people-to-people exchange have suffered due to the geopolitical climate of mutual distrust and fear. But I suspect this will turn around because Xi Jinping declared recently that China was ready to receive 50,000 Americans to study in China over the next 5 years. And if that promise holds true, then we should see a renewal of people-to-people exchange.
I think for the engagement policy, I think people might want to recall where we started with this policy. The engagement with China back in 1972, it was not motivated by primarily not motivated by the desire to change China politically. It was motivated by the Cold War consideration, the Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union. And fast track into 1991, the Soviet did disintegrate. So one could say that in terms of the Great Strategic Triangle, this alignment strategy with China was indeed successful and produced the end of the Cold War. So that's one of the factors. And the other factor is that the engagement policy, if you look at the success or the failure, or let's talk about success first, for United States and for China, a big part of this is based on the fact that China does have the largest market in the world, with its 1.4 billion people. It's an extremely important market for any US companies that want to compete successfully on a global market. So to have China open up to the world, it unleashed remarkable market and economic potential. it lifted millions of people out of poverty in China. And it also created tremendous business opportunities for US companies, as well as for Chinese companies that has grown out of that reform and opening up era. So from both, I would say, a foreign policy grand strategy perspective and from an economic policy perspective, the engagement policy has been beneficial for both US and China. Then if we're going to talk about the failure, like we mentioned earlier, that it's engagement about changing China. It's engagement about making China more like us, politically, economically, because if that is the criteria, then yes, engagement has not succeeded. But on the other hand, to say that engagement has created nothing and failed miserably, that also ignores and neglects realities that have taken place since 1972.
What lessons from engagement should we remember for the future?
So I teach Chinese politics, and a number of my students are actually Chinese students studying abroad from China. And you see a very diverse range of views. Some of them are staunch supporters of the Chinese Communist Party of Beijing. Others see Beijing as a repressor of Hong Kong and an aggressor in the Taiwan Straits. And still there's a middle range that are unsure of what to think exactly about their own country because they recognize that they've been taught back home through the patriotic education system that is censored. And so they want to learn a different version of Chinese history. So why I say this, because when I envision a future where hawks in DC insist on a strategy of containment, which is one that is characterized by deterrence over reassurance, this could have a direct impact on who ends up or doesn't end up in our classrooms, because we saw that when decoupling became a dominant strategy under Trump and then later in the early years of the Biden era, people-to-people exchanges came to a stop, but it really, really diminished. So instead of having a diverse classroom where there's a marketplace of ideas clashing with one another, we could possibly end up with classrooms full of Americans learning about liberal values without ever encountering a Chinese counterpart or learning how to speak or interact with a colleague from a rival country. And on the other side of the pond, we get a generation of Chinese youth who've possibly never set foot in DC or San Francisco or Minnesota or Georgia. They would be only learning about the US through WeChat news.
I think my answer to this question is that the only constant is change. And that is true for every single foreign policy initiative that we're looking at. So when we assess engagement, I think historically it did achieve massive value for the US grand strategy. It also achieved massive success for the Chinese re-engagement with the world. And now, 50 years later, or 40 years later, some people would call it, we are looking at a different China, and US and China are in different places. It doesn't mean that engagement did not have its historical value or its historical purpose. It just means that the situation has changed, and we are looking at a new geopolitical reality that puts US and China in a much more intense competition at this moment. But to deny that engagement ever had value, or to regret that we created a policy or we adopted policy and created China as it is today, it simply forgoes and neglects the primary purpose that engagement policy or our engagement with China has served, which was to counter the Soviet Union and also to release the great market potential that China has to offer. Now that Washington has declared engagement as over, and we are looking at basically the new era of US-China relations, it has been ongoing for a number of years. I think people tend to forget that even when US and China are engaged in this extreme competition, as President Biden put it, there are still common ground that the two countries need to seek, and they do seek those common ground. And I'm not talking about cooperations and climate change or cooperation, the resumption of meal-to-meal dialogue. I'm talking about the basic requirement for war prevention, that even if cooperation is not possible, between US and China to prevent an armed conflict between the number one and number two powers in the world is still a very worthy cause.